Of our 7 Investing podcast, where it's our mission to empower you to invest in your future. You can learn more about our long-term investing approach and see all of the stocks we've ever officially recommended at 7investing.com/subscribe. My name is Simon Erickson. I'm the founder of 7 Investing. I have a very exciting guest for the program here today, one I've been looking forward to having back for quite some time. Tiernan Ray is the founder and the writer of the Technology Letter. He's been following the tech industry for several decades. I always consider him far ahead of the curve when it comes to learning about new and innovative technology trends. Tiernan, I say this every time, but I'll say it once again. It's a true pleasure to have you back again for the 7 Investing podcast.
It's great to be here. It's great to be speaking with you. Thank you, Simon.
Tiernan, we've chatted quite a few times about the topic we'll be discussing today, which is quantum computing. And again, the reason we follow this is because we want to kind of go where the puck is heading. We want to look at things that are 3 or 5 years out. Seems like quantum might always perpetually be 3 to 5 years out. But I'd like to take a look at kind of where does this field stand to set the table for the conversation. Let's talk first about some of the challenges that quantum computing is currently facing. I know that the Technology Letter, you just published a piece on this today that I wanted to dive into. And then maybe a little bit farther down, we'll talk about the technology roadmap and some of the companies that are publicly traded. But first and foremost, Tiernan, you and I chatted about quantum computing back in 2021. It was the summer of SPACs. Everybody was so excited. There was a ton of enthusiasm about this, the hockey stick projections, and everyone was just super enthusiastic about getting into quantum. It feels like it kind of calmed down in the years past that, but the enthusiasm is back again today. Maybe let's first discuss about the piece that you just wrote for the Technology Letter. There's still a lot of challenges and issues that quantum is facing today.
There are, Simon, and the biggest issue is scaling. In semiconductor devices, PCs and servers, you've had 6 decades of scaling, which just means that integrated circuits get more complex, they have more transistors. And as the machine gets bigger, basically, you can do proportionately more work. And so you always measure progress in electronics based on, can you do more work with the latest generation of the technology? And we've seen that for 6 decades with Intel Xeon processors, with AMD processors. We've seen that with NVIDIA GPUs quite strikingly in the last few years, going through the various iterations of Vera and Rubin, each of them getting more powerful because of continued progress in semiconductor physics and that amazing machinery of Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing. So the various companies, IonQ, Braket, D-Wave, have not shown that they can scale in the same way. They simply do not have a track record of building bigger and bigger chips, if you will, by whatever means they build chips that are quantum. They simply don't have a track record of steadily increasing the number of logical functions they can perform so that they get a proportionate payoff.
Okay, and I want to go one step upstream of what you just described, because last time we chatted, you recommended a book, which I have on back order at my library. They have not been able to find it yet. They're trying to send it from Dallas. But you said The Revolution in Miniature was the book that kind of described the 6 decades of progress and innovation we've had in transistors and integrated circuits, and then, all the semiconductors we have today. But it started at just the simple binary building blocks of zeros and ones, on and off switches that we put in integrated circuits. You described last time we talked about we're still in the transistor age of quantum, where we've got qubits. We can kind of show some different physics, quantum physics, as opposed to kind of the traditional binary physics for classical computers. But it seems like we're still super early. We haven't even figured out how to build these to connect with one another just yet.
That's right, Simon. In the 1940s, the transistor was really refined to be an alternative to the vacuum tube. All computers at the time, the ENIAC and various room-sized computers, were built from vacuum tubes. It was several years later before we got the integrated circuit, where instead of people assembling by hand a transistor to try to make several series of transistors, which you need if you're going to do a logic function in a computer, instead they could fabricate them as a single planar device, the integrated circuit. So it took from, let's say, 1947 until 1961, 62, 63. Once they had the functional thing, it took them another 15 years or so to get to integrated circuits where you had Moore's law, and you could then sort of predictably shrink feature sizes down sub-micron eventually, right? Over 6 decades. That was the key, was to build multiple devices, quote unquote, in a single planar device that you put through one process, which is the whole revolution that we've had. And so we're at the transistor phase. And the funny thing is, before they were used in integrated circuits, transistors revolutionized radio, right? You had a transistor radio, which was a breakthrough device. I don't think we've even seen yet the transistor radio equivalent of quantum, where manufacturing a couple qubits produces something that you say, wow, we didn't have this before, and now we have it, in the sense of a killer app where the transistor became a ubiquitous thing that was carried by everyone, that was suddenly portable audio. So we're not even at the transistor radio phase of the transistor era in electronics as far as quantum is concerned.
Yeah, that's right. And something we should always remind everyone listening is that a quantum computer is not just a faster classical computer. This is completely different physical laws where we've got block spheres. We're not just managing, zeros and ones, electrons on or off going through an integrated circuit. We've now got things like trapping ions. We've got spins of electrons or even photonics. I mean, it feels like there are a bunch of different technologies competing to become the transistor or the radio of the quantum age. From what I've seen, at least in the roadmap of the companies that have disclosed that they're doing work on quantum right now, Tiernan, and you mentioned this as well, it seems to be kind of a trade-off between how fast do you want the quantum computer to be versus how stable do you want the quantum computer to be. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between quantum speeds and coherence and the challenges that the roadmap that these companies are technically trying to solve these problems?
Yeah, you need to have increasing numbers of the transistor equivalent, the qubits, but you also need to be able to have those qubits last for an actual period of time in which you can conduct an operation before you make a measurement of the quantum operation. So all of the goodness of quantum exists in the realm where there's a superposition of multiple qubits, and that is not accessible to us until we measure it. And in order for that reaction of the qubits to take place, you need what's called coherence time before they decohere. They decohere because of interference from the real world, from cosmic rays, other sorts of things. And so as you build up these qubits, you're right, fidelity matters. You'll hear companies such as IonQ talk about, we not only have a plan for more qubits, we're going to be the most fidelitous qubits, meaning they will have a coherence time that will allow them to run each individual qubit long enough that it can interact with other qubits and there can actually be a logical operation. So fidelity becomes another dimension of this in order to get some kind of stable operation.
Okay, and so the bigger picture reason we would want to compute a quantum computer as opposed to a classical computer is basically, we built 6 decades of coding and doing these operations with binary. Everything was just these operations that you ran in series and then parallel with GPUs, but it was still kind of line by line of code trying to ultimately come out with an output of some input of calculations we were looking to do. A quantum is significantly faster at running multiple calculations from many inputs at the exact same time. And with the combination of coherence and superposition, as you just mentioned, that would be a completely game changer, step change in terms of calculating things much, much more powerfully and complexly than a traditional computer. Do I have that right, Tiernan? Is there any other reason that a quantum stands out versus a classical?
That's the theory, Simon. You've articulated the theory well. Because you have to increase the number of transistors based on the number of values you have to compute. If you have thousands of values, you have to have 2 to the n minus 1. So there's an exponential increase. There's actually an exponent based on the number of values. As n gets bigger, you have to have more and more transistors to have more and more logic gates. So you start building out more and more either larger circuits or taking more steps of the same circuits. And so it runs longer in time. And so that's where you start to reach a ceiling on what a normal computer can do. With the superposition, in theory, of qubits, you could run all 1,000 values in one operation on the same collection, right, of qubits. And so you could basically do simultaneously the work you have to do in time or in space with these traditional computers. That's the theory. The issue, of course, is not all problems are equal. And so if you do something more efficiently, it could still take a long time. You could still not get the correct answer, because when you measure the qubit, when you go from the quantum realm to I need a real 1 or 0 that's in my traditional circuitry, you have this stage called measurement, and you have a possibility that you'll get a probabilistic answer that's not correct. It's a little bit like, you go to ChatGPT and it seems to know a lot until it has, what could be called confabulation or a hallucination, however you want to call it. It comes out with a wrong answer. And so all of the power suddenly is in question. And so you have a probabilistic element that's sort of analogous in quantum, which means that you might run this more efficiently, but still have to run it for a long time if it's a big problem, and still get a wrong answer. So everything you said is correct in theory, but in practice, there's many caveats to whether it can work.
Yeah, great points. Some of the interesting quotes that others have mentioned about this space and the challenges about accuracy. I saw that written that there were more red flags in a People's Liberation Army parade, a clever one there. And then the Quambies, the quantum zombies,
I love that.
the undead narratives of quantum advantage. Is it even going to work? I think is the question that we're training it to solve problems we know the answers to. But if you're actually going to unleash it the way that it should be intended, there's no guarantee of accuracy, right?
There isn't. You're still trying to find out which problems might really receive a boost, because it's not true that you can immediately apply the theory that you explained earlier and get a significant, meaningful improvement in efficiency and processing for every single problem. So we're still finding out which problems will yield themselves as, you could call it, the killer app if you want.
I do want to talk about the killer app in just a minute. Before we get past this segment, I want to ask you, is Moore's Law dead, Tiernan? We've been saying this for decades that, transistors were going to reach, we've gotten so many economies of scale, and Moore's Law was so good for so many years. Maybe they're slowing down. It's diminishing returns as we're now sub 2 nanometers. I believe sub 1 nanometer now for Taiwan Semi in some instances. Are we getting past this, or is it advanced packaging, stacking chips on top of each other and other things that we're going to keep seeing smaller and smaller transistors? Or do you think that by necessity, we've got to find a new architecture?
Moore's Law is dead. I think Intel would never admit that, but it's dead in the sense, Simon, that it doesn't predictably deliver the kind of scaling that we saw for 6 decades, where every 18 months, maybe 24 months, but usually 18 months, you would get a doubling in the number of transistors, which meant you would have the same computing power for half the money. That's how your PC got cheaper. Or you would have double the computing power for the same money. That's how, the power users would buy the latest Intel Core series, and suddenly it's a faster PC. So we don't get that kind of predictable improvement every 18 months. And that means it's not a law. It's not a law if it was never a law of nature, but the word law was meant that it predictably improved. And if it doesn't predictably improve, then it's not a law. What you still do have are improvements. Taiwan Semiconductor does find new ways to do things, as do all the fabs, Global and Tower Semiconductor. But you're right, you now start to move to, well, a decade ago, AMD pioneered chiplets in mass manufacturing, where we can't build enough big chips, so we build smaller ones and we assemble them on a substrate as if it's one big chip. And that chiplet approach totally took off in the industry, and you're seeing that spread. And now you're also seeing packaging, as you point out, ways to stack die with one another, stack them either lay them out horizontally like chiplets, or stack them vertically, which is what is happening, for example, with DRAM memory at Micron and others, which is, if we need more storage of bits, we have to go vertical now. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The packaging age is upon us, and part of it is because you can't reliably just turn the dial and shrink the transistors year after year.
It's getting harder. It's requiring more creative and perhaps even more expensive solutions.
It is, and I think it's brilliant to bring it up, because it is a gating factor for everyone, including IonQ, Rigetti, D-Wave, IBM, Google, Amazon, Microsoft. Anyone who wants to fabricate a quantum device is having to go to Taiwan Semi or someone else and deal with these same scaling issues. Now, the one thing that the IonQs of the world will claim is, well, we can actually build these qubits in an older process technology. because every time the features get smaller, whenever they do at Taiwan Semi to make the latest cutting edge Rubin GPU, every time that happens, there's a bunch of the old stuff left that is fully depreciated but can be used to make stuff. And usually it's used to make stuff that's less demanding. So the chip that's inside your wireless earbuds might be an older technology. It might be something crazy like quarter micron, right? 250 million, and so that older technology that's fully depreciated can sometimes be a cheap way to make other devices. And there's a claim by the quantum folks, we can use the older stuff, and so we can use the cheap depreciated technology. I think that also is a promise that remains to be proven. But generally, broadly speaking, your point is well taken that everyone's dealing, NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, everyone is dealing with the issue of Moore's Law and the issue of how to continue to get more out of the same semiconductor manufacturing technology. And that includes the quantum companies that have to, at some point, benefit in some way from the technologies for manufacturing that are out there.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about those technologies. Well, let's go back to the future here. We're going back to the year 1957, but it's actually the year 2025, where we're kind of developing the roadmaps of these different approaches to quantum computing. Because back in 57, we were trying to create a CPU, an integrated circuit built off of binary and the transistors and all of the ways that companies, built Moore's Law over the next 6 decades. But now quantum computing is not a universal term. There are different approaches that we're starting to see some companies put their bets on and invest in. Just a couple of examples. Again, this is kind of the trade-off of what is possible and maybe perhaps easier and more stable versus do you want to take a swing for the fences and do something that's very difficult that could be very fast and solve problems that the other technologies could not. Just to key you up with a couple of these, Tiernan, but we've seen now IonQ has gone public. It's a publicly traded company that is trying to do trapped ion technology. This is where you're manipulating atoms in a way that you can actually monitor and measure the quantum outputs from them. We've got superconducting technologies where there's spins of electrons in a similar way that you're manipulating. And then we've also got a new field of photonics from privately held companies like PsiQuantum, not Quantinuum. PsiQuantum is pursuing photonics. Which could be much, much faster, but don't have the same stability as ion trapping. Tiernan, I know this is early. I know we're beginning our first inning, but I have to ask you the question, which one of these do you think shows the most promise? And if you're going to bet on one of these horses in the race, which one are you going after?
None of these companies has shown that they can scale any of these approaches. The larger companies you're mentioning, Simon, such as IBM and Google is probably the poster child for the superconducting approach, and they've been well publicized. They are at a stage of a handful of qubits, so they don't have the equivalent of an integrated circuit, and that's very clear. That's out there. IonQ, in their case, is now saying, after they acquired Oxford Ionics, a British company, this year for about $1 billion, that they're going to dispense with what was an optical approach where they use mirrors, modulators, laser light sources, and now they're going to put it into an integrated circuit that will use radio frequency waves. So you could imagine it might be a little bit closer to something like a Qualcomm baseband, where the chip's function is to control radio frequency signals. And the point of that is you can create a magnetic field that can manipulate the trapped ion, similar to how up until now IonQ has been using lasers, right? You have lasers hitting the trapped ion and manipulating it. Now they're going to do it in radio frequency. And the idea is it's easier to make a radio frequency chip than it is to make a bunch of all kinds of optical components. And so all of these companies have these wonderful, different, novel approaches. But again, none of them have shown that this is scalable. Google has not shown that superconducting is scalable in terms of getting to potentially thousands of qubits in a single device, like an integrated circuit. But all of the promises from IonQ about radio frequency are based on the work of a startup, Oxford Ionics, that to date has not produced a massively parallel device that could lead to hundreds or thousands of logical operations in sequence, which is what a programmer needs if they're going to build an algorithm. So I hate to punt on this, but I have seen none of these companies demonstrate that any of these approaches are scalable. I see lots of things in PowerPoint that say they promise they will be scalable. The line always goes, up and to the right about how they're going to reach several thousand qubits by certain year. Right now, 2030 is the year when everyone reaches scale, but it's in PowerPoint. They haven't demonstrated it for real.
How important is the number of qubits that these companies are reporting? Is this something that's an important metric to you, or is this just something that's a neat R&D milestone for them?
It's not important. It's a way to market what they can do at the moment. And if you have 10 qubits and the other person has 5, you have twice as many qubits. You know, if you have 100 qubits and the other person has 50, you have twice as many. So it's bragging rights. But it's, while it is debatable how many qubits you need, and I think some of that we're finding out in research, it's pretty clear with the work we've seen done so far that tens of qubits does not yet yield a lot of interesting broad-based applications. And so it's pretty clear these companies are sort of below a floor of what it would be considered a kind of a minimum viable product.
Yep. And then one last question as we're still talking, nerding out on the technologies here, Tiernan. I have to ask you while I've got you here, your thoughts on photonics and optics, because that's something that wasn't even being talked about 5 years ago. And now you've got companies like PsiQuantum, which NVIDIA just participated in one of the funding rounds for, saying, we're going to look at photons, not electrons, not, atoms or the spins of electrons, completely different way of measuring. It feels super early, but can you tell us a little bit about, is this the holy grail of quantum? Is it even feasible to have a photonic quantum computer?
It's certainly feasible because it's one of the control mechanisms for an individual particle. You can shine a light on it and you can manipulate it by putting the individual qubit into whatever kind of state in that block sphere you mentioned that you want, and you can get superpositions. Here's the thing, Simon, you can do photonic computing that's not quantum computing, meaning you can do plain old-fashioned ones and zeros where it is not indeterminate. There is no probabilistic element. It is actually a photonic manipulation of a traditional bit. And I think that's actually more likely to be a near-term interesting benefit to optical technologies, to all the optical technologies, which is to build chips that are light wave guides that are integrated on a semiconductor. And the technology there has also been in development for decades and is getting more mature. And it's very easy since you have optical connections in the data center backing up NVIDIA GPUs in the rack across the room, and then actually over the egress across metropolitan areas. You have Sienna and others that are transporting bits now between data centers, because sometimes you need to cluster data centers. You can see the photonic integrated circuit, right, a PIC, being a non-quantum, plain old-fashioned logical extension of the processing of, say, AI data centers. And so you just speed up using the speed of light, basically. That's a much more realistic, to my mind, near-term viable product that has a clear application. It's just speeding up either the transmission or the actual processing of the bits in the plain old-fashioned real-world domain, not worrying about the quantum interactions.
Yep. And so just to put a bow on the technology segment of this conversation, quantum computers are trying to manipulate particles, whether those be atoms, whether those be electronic spins or whatever else it is. And then because of the elements of coherence and superposition, just measure them in a way that can do calculations and manipulations of those particles much, much more significantly more efficiently than a classical. That's the appeal of what we want to do with quantum computing. Is it correct?
Right.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
That's the theory.
So let's talk about how companies might actually be using this now, because we're starting to see some science experiments, at least getting some media headlines and coverage from them. AstraZeneca was one of them. They wanted to do a quantum experiment for drug discovery. They set up a designed experiment that you profiled here recently. It was not only using a quantum computer to do it, but it was also using a lot of the GPU cores that were powered by NVIDIA. How are GPUs working with quantum computing? And is this in a strange way, perhaps counterintuitively good for the GPU industry, that there's even quantum computers out there?
That's right. When you do these experiments, such as IonQ did with the help of NVIDIA, Amazon AWS, and AstraZeneca, you can take a problem and you can break it into parts. It might be, in this case, combinatorial chemistry, where you're trying to speed up all of the work that gets done in the lab at the beginning of drug development to figure out what is the chemistry, what kinds of properties do we want to get out of whatever our eventual drug is. And you have to do a lot of complex simulating of molecules at that outset. It turns out in this experiment, a very small portion at the outset was done with, I think, 16 qubits on the IonQ machine. It was the Forte system, so it's a current system. And basically you run some stuff in the quantum domain, and then you measure it, and you get your normal ones and zeros, and then you put them into the NVIDIA GPUs. It turns out most of the computing work is actually done by the NVIDIA GPU, right? So you have 1 million equivalent cores when you look at all of the time spent on Amazon AWS in GPU clusters. It adds up to 1 million cores running at some, I think it was days that they said to do this,
Wow.
right? So it wasn't instantaneous. And the reason is the quantum part is a small part of it. I think that one of the quoted speedups was 600 times. So one element of this problem could be done 600 times faster with the quantum portion, the Forte portion from IonQ. And that's not insignificant, and it is meaningful. The question becomes, how much money do you invest, and how many problems can you find where taking the small part is worth investing in quantum to do that several hundred times speed up? So remember, Simon, to your earlier point about the theory, what everyone fantasizes about is quantum, quote unquote, supremacy. Sometimes it's called an advantage. It's really supposed to be for problems that you could never do on a traditional computer. In the case of the AstraZeneca work, you could do this, right? And so it might be that you collapse it from, let's say, months to days, meaningful. But then the question is it a big enough gap that you would not only spend the time to learn how to use the quantum computer, invest money in using it at AWS, but also, remember, invest in millions of NVIDIA GPU cores. And at some point, it becomes a question of, if you can speed up something that's huge, is it worth doing that at all? Because you might find other approaches in the traditional computing realm. Maybe they take a little longer, but maybe they'd be more in line with what you're built to do as an operation, as a firm. And so you can get these speed ups, but you still are spending tons of money on GPU chips.
Sure. So there's a very small portion of the market, the AstraZenecas, or the massive companies that have got massively complex problems,
Right.
like drug development, how proteins are moving around or interacting with each other for cancer treatments, or what it might be. But certain problems are going to be very time consuming for GPUs to compute. And
Right.
so perhaps those can be offloaded to the quantum computer. And then it's an economical question of, is this actually speeding it up enough for us
Right.
to pursue the quantum versus what's available out there today?
Correct.
Yep.
Right. Exactly.
Yep. Okay. And so my second question on this one is, we do have quantum computers available from AWS. AWS Braket has now got a quantum computer. You can actually hire it out, a dedicated IonQ quantum computer for $7,000 an hour. That's more than 300 times more expensive than renting out GPUs on CoreWeave, which is now a big purchaser of NVIDIA's GPU chips, which are $22 an hour. Tiernan, is this still going to be a really complex science project for the largest companies like AstraZeneca? Are you ever going to see, at least within the next decade, companies tapping into a quantum computer on the cloud to do smaller applications?
You won't see that, Simon, until you see scaling, which means that you can bring down the cost. You're very right. However, for an AstraZeneca, $7,000 an hour is nothing, right? You could spend days doing that, and it'd be a fraction of your R&D budget. So you're right. There are science projects, but for some large firms, that is certainly well within the budget. So I would expect that there's a market for AWS Braket quantum services for large companies that, let's say it's, you want to just cover your bets. You want to make sure that you don't lose track of what quantum can do. And so you devote some amount of your corporate resources in terms of people and money and time to play with these computers on Braket and see what they can do. And you run experiments of the kind that you had with the Forte IonQ system and millions of NVIDIA GPUs. And you just say, yeah, we're going to invest in keeping tabs on it. So yes, there is a very viable market to do that kind of R&D work to make sure you're on top of it if you're a firm that could someday benefit in 5 or 10 years if in fact scaling happens and the cost collapses, and then it's as cheap as normal cloud computing, and you say, yeah, we're just going to send all that stuff to the cloud.
I want to change gears here and go to a different conversation. That is one kind of interesting, other than the commercial appeal of, is a quantum computer more economical for a company to offload some of that computing to the quantum machine rather than the traditional classic? I want to talk if there's a perhaps this is nationally funded, but a strategic quantum advantage that ever comes into play here. And it's kind of like an arms race, Tiernan. Are there certain applications that aren't just for, AstraZeneca wanted to develop drugs, but perhaps if a quantum computer is faster or able to handle more complex things, where there are two adversaries kind of going in this chess match, is there going to be kind of an arms race of who's got the faster computer that can beat the other one? I'm thinking in terms of cryptography or cybersecurity protections out there, AI that's going into military applications, maybe even stuff in the space race, the stuff that makes me kind of scared and shudder even thinking about it. But there's big dollars of contracts from Department of Defense and elsewhere. Do you think quantum has any place in this, or is that still something that's just kind of a same science project like the commercial world's doing?
The common story, Simon, is cracking, right, RSA encryption that underlies all transactions. And there I cited in the article that I wrote by a consultant, Olivier Ezrati, this being one of the misconceptions, right? And he points out that you're not going to get cracking of traditional encryption anytime soon. That's at least a decade away. Companies that are marketing quantum will say that we're just on the threshold of RSA encryption being completely cracked. However, so that appears to be something of a myth. However, one of the near-term applications that IonQ does talk about, and they talked a lot about in their analyst day, is to your point about nation states, that there are a lot of entities, good or bad entities, that are kind of hoovering up existing encryption keys. So they're taking the keys that underlie current passwords, etc., and they're storing them in a database, and they're keeping them there for the day when they get the working quantum machine that will allow them to suddenly crack all of this. It's kind of like you take the safe out of the bank and then you leave it in your bedroom until you find a drill that will allow you to get into it. So there's this idea that stuff is being stockpiled in the way of information, conventional information, that will someday be cracked, and that companies are investing in either protecting it by keeping it offline or stealing it to hold on to it for the day they can break it with quantum. And one of the near-term applications that IonQ sells is they sell a networking component where there is cryptically safe transmission via quantum teleportation of these keys, with the idea that if you can't do all the things we've been talking about, like efficiently process a full application, you could at least transmit your keys safely encoded as a quantum kind of representation. And so that is a near-term quantum application of quantum networking that doesn't involve any processing. It just involves transmitting bits, usually using fiber optics, that would pertain to security, national security, the question of RSA encryption, etc. And so that's IonQ at least makes the argument that they will get near-term revenue from everyone suddenly wanting to kind of safely move stuff around, waiting for the day when bad people might be able to crack it.
And implications for the cybersecurity industry, maybe even particularly for cryptocurrencies. We now got digital money that's out there that's essentially just code, which is being protected by the same security that we've had for decades. I mean, is this going to touch the cybersecurity industry in a meaningful way?
It's not going to immediately, because the cybersecurity industry can continue to work with the existing RSA encryption that is apparently not breakable by quantum technologies at this point. I think well before we get to the point where it is crackable, you will have a lot of experimentation by Palo Alto Networks, and Fortinet and Checkpoint security vendors with IBM, with industry, where they're, again, running these kinds of experiments to see what's possible. And it goes back to your point about quantum R&D. You have people trying this all the time, trying to run the algorithms that might crack RSA encryption and see, are we closer on a daily basis to that happening?
Yeah, and then as I'm kind of closing this out, Tiernan, you had mentioned of the publicly traded quantum computing stocks right now. I believe I have it correct that the median price to forward sales ratio of them is 260 times right now.
Yeah.
That's sounding like the SPAC summer of 2021, super high expectations. Even though the base is still very, very small. At the same time, we're seeing hundreds of billions of dollars deployed by the large tech companies into their own data centers, which are, of course, using GPUs from NVIDIA and others. Huge projects. It seems like they have certainly hit scale with this. Do you think quantum computing is investable right now, or is this still something that's worth monitoring? Could be interesting a couple years out, but you're not touching anything at 260 times sales.
It's speculation. It's not if it's trading at 260 times sales, it's not an investment, meaning you have no support via the appreciation of those assets. What you're really buying is you're buying a call option on one of these companies, IonQ, Rigetti, D-Wave, will get acquired by a much larger tech company and be added to whatever their stockpile of stuff is. So I think most of the stock price currently reflects M&A expectations. There's always an expectation if something's a hot property, it's going to get bought. And that's, it's possible. You do have to consider that, at 260 times sales, these companies are large. I haven't checked lately the market cap. I'm looking now. So market cap is almost 19 billion for IonQ,
Wow.
which is kind of like they're closing in on 100 million in annual revenue, which is not a lot of revenue, but they have you could say they have the most solid income statement. None of these companies make any money. So to buy $19 billion worth of a company is not a small acquisition, but I guess you could say that somebody out there imagines, IBM's going to buy IonQ or Google's going to buy it. Somebody's going to buy them. That's what's going to happen. So that's what's reflecting the price. So it's a long-winded way of saying it is not an investment because it is not supported by the natural appreciation and time that can be expected of the assets. It is strictly price momentum based on mostly M&A, maybe to some extent the headlines, as long as headlines keep coming out about the next IonQ system or the next Rigetti system, the next number of qubits. Headlines can also add to price momentum. So it's speculation.
Sure. And would the quantum computers, if we do get to a scale, if we start building this up, do you start to see the IonQs and the pure plays of the world investing heavily in manufacturing quantum computers, or does that go to someone like a Taiwan Semi to build some new lines for how is the manufacturing you think like this going to play out?
Again, some of these companies insist they'll go and use fully depreciated assets at Taiwan Semi. None of them will be building factories, so that's probably the principal option. It remains to be seen whether they can really use cheaper integrated circuit process technology to build this stuff. I think that's part of the scaling challenge. It's probably the case they will have to go to capital markets again, to your point, do lots more debt and equity raises in order to have the kind of scale manufacturing. If it's viable, in order to do it, they'll need a lot more money.
Sure. And then last question is the big tech companies. You always see IBM and Google and even Microsoft kind of each claiming that they've got quantum supremacy over each other. They've got more qubits, whatever it is. Do you see them all as kind of equals in this field, Tiernan? Is there one that you think is pulled ahead of the others in terms of their innovation for quantum, or at least how seriously they're taking this?
IBM and Google have dueling positions in terms of the papers they publish. I had the impression with Google's chip last December, the Willow chip, that Google really had the most clear, thoughtful advances in superconducting qubits. And I would be inclined to give Google the edge over IBM as far as two heavily publishing quantum research facilities. However, I will note that others like to point to IBM. The CEO, Niccolo de Masi at IonQ, likes to say that IBM is the only company that is even close to IonQ, which is sort of for marketing purposes. But it's possible that he sees something I don't, and that IBM is really in the pole position amongst the giant companies. But my sense would have been that Google is in the lead, and maybe IBM, Amazon close seconds, and Microsoft's the Majorana sort of topological qubit that they've been pursuing has had so much controversy that I think Microsoft is a far distant third or fourth. It remains to be seen if what they have is actually viable. There's a lot of scientific controversy about it. That's my impression from the outside.
Yes, and then back to the scale question about the inflection points. How this typically works out. We've seen IonQ, even in the conversations we've been having about them for, I think, maybe it's been 5 or 7 years now, Tiernan, go from less than $1 million in revenue to all of a sudden they're at $10 million of revenue. Now they're at $50 million of revenue. It's a 50x increase in revenue in 3 years for this company, but it's still only $50 million. I mean, $19 billion valuation. You said it's highly speculative, but do you think there is enough demand at the top of the big organizations? Now you've got a functional quantum computer, whether or not it's the perfect one in all things, but is there going to be a continuation of this inflection point, even from $50 million to 100 to $500 million and so forth?
Well, I mean, I can tell you what the street thinks. So the income statement projections, are a doubling this year to roughly 91 million. So they're not at 100 million yet, but they're getting there. The street currently calls for still a very high rate of growth, 87% in calendar 26, 171 million. Maybe they'll close in. If the street is right, in 4 years, they would be closing in on $500 million. And they would be doing so at a clip of 56%. Now, I think if they get there, that's terrific, and would be a validation, because I don't think they're going to make it unless they have solved some of the scale issues. There is the scale issue, meaning that estimate is not guaranteed. It's just an estimate. And until we get there, there's plenty of opportunity for calendar 26 and 27 to see those numbers also go down. In other words, all of these projections are building on the scale promise of IonQ. So if they can make it to $500 million, good for them. It is, again, still the law of small numbers, Simon. To get to 50 million from 1 million is amazing, but it's still just $50 million. To get to $500 million, Bill Gates used to say when he's running Microsoft, it's all about getting to $1 billion. And from what I've heard from talking with CEOs today, it's still about getting to $1 billion. So if you're at $500 million in annual revenue, your friends and your parents will be impressed, but something remains out of your reach, that you haven't reached the scale of being $1 billion company.
Yeah, fantastic. Perpetually 5 years out. It's going to be there in 5 years, and then we'll talk about that. Well, once again, Tiernan Ray, the technology letter is the service that he runs. I've been following it, and a paying subscriber since day one, so I can tell you it is worth checking out if you want to see coverage and innovation, specifically in software and semiconductors and in cool new things like quantum computing. You can also follow him on X at let's see, it's Tiernan Ray Tech, correct? Tiernan is your Twitter. Yeah, okay, great. So follow him there too. Some great coverage. And Tiernan, once again, thanks very much for joining me again to talk about quantum here for 7 Investing.
Thank you, Simon, for having me.
And a reminder for everyone to do your own diligence. We're talking about some neat things out there, but certainly quantum computing is still very, very highly speculative. Don't take anything as the gospel that we talk about on this podcast. We encourage everyone as an individual investor to do their own diligence on any positions they're interested in. My name is Simon Erickson. Once again, thanks for tuning into this edition of the 7 Investing podcast on quantum computing. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you again next week.